Well, hello everyone. My name is Charl from Walt, and I greet you from the sunny city of Cape Town in South Africa. I'm based here in Cape Town for a lot of strange reasons, but my role is head of security research for Orange Cyber Defense Global. And in that capacity, it's my job to really work on behalf of the company and on behalf of you, our customers, to understand how the security landscape is shaping around us and to direct our strategies and our operations in accordance with that change. And today, I have been asked to talk to you about the impacts of COVID-19 on the security landscape. And that's a very large question to address. If you're really interested, we have a white paper on the topic that you can download from our website. But given that we have sort of 25 odd minutes together today, I thought what I'd do is to rather start from a perspective that I believe exists kind of broadly in the security community. And it's reflected by this article published on behalf of AT&T that argues that you as security practitioners are concerned that your workers are more vulnerable because they are working from home. Because they're sitting on a couch in their living room and not at a desk in a cubicle. The concern is that for some reason now they're more insecure. And I suppose the question is that true? And if it's true, why is it true? And it's important that we get that right, because these assumptions are going to shape our planning and our strategies for several years to come, I believe. So I want to attack that question by really looking at just a few important markers that we can examine via data about how the pandemic changed security. I'm going to start by looking at the attackers. What do we know about how the attackers behaved over that period? Then we want to look at our users. What do we know about the sort of incidents and the exploits that our users had to endure? And then I want to look at the technology and how the technology landscape changed over the period. And finally, I'm going to try and make the argument to you that the real impact of COVID is not in the small technical changes that we observed during the lockdown, but rather in the sort of bigger long-term systemic changes that it represented. So let's start by looking at the attacker. The hypothesis that we and others put forward at the beginning of the pandemic was that attackers would change their behavior significantly during the lockdowns. And the reasoning was that they would focus on attacking end users more, that they would exploit the fact that users at home, compromise their psychological vulnerability. But what did we actually see? Well, this chart, which isn't authentically from us, this is a chart from data presented by by Checkpoint, shows that in fact the reality was quite different. If we look at the blue line, which represents all the attacks that Checkpoint recorded over this period, we'll see that over the lockdown period, the number of attacks actually dropped, and in fact dropped quite significantly to the order of about 20%. Attacks related to COVID, which are reflected by the orange line, this includes things like COVID-related phishing attacks and water holding attacks, that sort of thing. Those did in fact increase over the period, but our understanding is firstly that they represent a minuscule portion, maybe less than 2% of all the attacks recorded over that period. And also that they didn't last very long. So you can see that they peaked April, May, but by July they were almost disappearing already. So we see that the attacker will pivot very quickly to exploit a specific theme like COVID or the American elections or the Olympics, whatever. But those pivots are very short-term and very regional. We also see something that we observed through all our data over this period, which is a general malaise, a slowing down of activity over the COVID period, at least during the first wave. This data also from Checkpoint shows the same thing on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, what they show is the kinds of executables that were being used in phishing attacks over this period. And the fascinating thing when you look at that list is just how old-fashioned it is. So, things like delivering or trying to deliver EXEs, XLS, doc files, etc. These are not, radical new techniques. These are old things. And what this says to us is that although the attacker might pivot their premise, the rationale under which they run their phishing campaign, for example, the fundamental approach, the fundamental TTPs actually didn't change. The other class of attacker that, of course, we have to look at is not just the criminal actor, but the state-sponsored actor. And we expected to see more activity by state-sponsored actors. This data, which is from our own intelligence engine, maps state-sponsored activity versus COVID-related activity. And you'll see that actually state-sponsored activity did not increase over the pandemic period. In fact, it dropped since the pandemic period and has only slowly been picking up since then. And the reason for this, we believe, is that attackers, state-sponsored attackers are a bureaucracy. They have a boss and a budget. They work standard hours, and so their capability to run operations was reduced during lockdown and not increased. I'm not going to talk to this whole slide. I'm leaving it here as a reference. But basically, what we're seeing in summary is that criminals pivot quickly in a short-lived way, but fundamentally their modus operandi did not change. Governments may change their targeting, to pursue other political goals, but in general, they're very institutionalized, and so those changes in behavior are relatively slow. And in general, what I'm going to argue throughout this presentation is that there were other more systemic factors that are changing the behavior of the attacker beyond what the impact that the lockdown had. So that's kind of what we think about the attacker. What about our people? Were our people more vulnerable because they were working from home? Now, I've got a lot of data I can share on this, but I won't have time. I'm going to draw your attention just to one data point, which I think sheds quite a lot of light on this. And I appreciate that the visuals here are a little bit hard, so forgive me for that. But basically what we're doing in this chart is we're tracking the number of security incidents recorded by our CyberSOCs in two different but comparable countries. The dark line represents France, and the light orange line represents Sweden. Now, the difference between France and Sweden, there's similar geographies for us in terms of operations. But France, of course, experienced a very strict lockdown, whereas Sweden, the effects of the lockdown were much lighter. And what we see is that over the lockdown period, which is represented by that gray block, the number of security incidents reported by our CyberSOCs decreased significantly in France to the order of about 30%. Whereas in Sweden, where there wasn't much lockdown, the number of security incidents stayed almost unchanged. And so what that says to us is that the effect of the lockdown was not to dramatically increase the number of incidents that we had to deal with our customers, but in fact, bizarrely, to reduce it. Now, that's not to say that lockdown didn't have other impacts. There was an enormous amount of activity at this time. Now, incident responders were running all over the place, but that activity didn't actually translate into confirmed incidents, which is what you're seeing in this chart. So in general, we don't see evidence to suggest that our users are actually more vulnerable to this sort of COVID-related themes. That may, of course, be because a lot of energy and effort went into educating users and our business customers ahead of time. The users do tend to fall. Some users will always fall for new scams, whether it's COVID or vaccines or Olympics or whatever. But that percentage seems to be relatively constant. And our partners and our own research around, for example, phishing education shows that users learn very quickly and respond very quickly. And finally, when we look at the criminal proceeds, so how much money was actually being, for example, transferred as Bitcoin due to kind of illicit transactions, we also don't see that the attackers were making more money during lockdown. What about technology, though? What changed in the technology space? And here, my tone is going to change a little bit, because we believe that some things did fundamentally change as a result, very specifically, of the COVID lockdown dynamic. So what we had hypothesized was that because of this sort of expected large-scale rollout of remote access technologies like VPNs, they would be rushed out in a hurry, they wouldn't be well maintained, and they'd be more frequently targeted by attackers. That was our hypothesis. Did that actually happen as expected? Well, the first thing we see, this is data from our support operations, is that indeed there was a very high level of demand for new VPN services, changes to VPNs, changes to secure remote access, etc. It's really quite stark. You can see how dramatically it changed over that period. There's other data that supports this also that I won't have time to share with you. But that assumption proved to be real. There was, and I'm sure it's pretty obvious, massive adoption or upscaling of some form of remote access capability to deal with the lockdown. At the same time, something else quite extraordinary happened. And I say extraordinary really because I think it's quite extraordinary. What you're seeing here is a study of the number of vulnerabilities formally released as what are called CVEs. So that's a formal designation of a recognized vulnerability in the technology. The orange line shows vulnerabilities published across all technologies. So the total sum of all vulnerabilities published per month over the first 3 quarters of 2020. And what we see when you look at May is this just incredible dip in outputs. And again, this for me speaks to the general observable condition of a malaise that occurred over the lockdown. There was simply less work being done over that period, somewhere across the chain. However, and that's extraordinary, by the way. That's like a 30% drop in productivity, if you like, in terms of the publication of vulnerabilities. The blue line, however, which is in a completely different axis, just to be clear, you'll see the axis on the right-hand side. It's much, much smaller numbers. But look at the change there. There, we have a consistently low number of vulnerabilities that peaks in an extraordinary way over May, to the extent that 4 times as many vulnerabilities were published in May relating to security products that we as a company either sell or manage. So we took a subset of technologies that we have a direct relationship with. We examined the number of vulnerabilities published in those technologies, and there was a 4-fold increase in vulnerabilities published for those technologies during that period. Now, if that intrigues you, have a look at our Security Navigator report. We examine the question in detail and try and understand why it happened. But basically, what's fair to say is that at a time where vulnerability researchers in general were slowing down, there was an incredible focus on finding vulnerabilities in exactly the kinds of technologies that were being rolled out to support our remote users. And not only was there an increase in the number of vulnerabilities, but we also saw on behalf of our customers a notable challenge with dealing with the vulnerabilities in those products. And what it was, a study that we did of the amount of time that it takes our customers to patch known problems in security technologies showed that a large majority, almost 57% of vulnerabilities were taking between 31 and 180 days to patch. Less than 20% of them were patched within seven days. So we had this almost perfect storm of a significant number of new vulnerabilities being released for security technologies, as well as those technologies now suddenly and unexpectedly becoming mission critical, supporting the entire business. And so this reluctance to to upgrade, patch, or change them in response to those security technologies. And the results of that confluence of events made those technologies extremely popular to target. And a number of high-profile incidents within the private sector exploited exactly those vulnerabilities. But perhaps more telling is this data, which was published by the American security agency, CISA, which speaks to the vulnerabilities being exploited by significant state actors in other countries. They published 20 vulnerabilities that are consistently and popularly used by nation-state actors in other countries. And of the 20, 6 of them involved remote access technologies, excuse me, or security technologies of some kind. So there was a perfect storm around secure remote access technologies that developed over exactly that COVID period. And that storm has abated somewhat now. I think the landscape has changed fundamentally, but certainly there is less of this that we're seeing since the end of the first wave. So if we look at the behavior of technology with regards to security over that period, what we're seeing is there was a significant increase for demand. It was focused at the beginning of the crisis. People needed to roll out remote access capabilities. They weren't able to patch those systems, upgrade them, configure them in the way that perhaps they would have liked to. And at the same time, there was just this wave of new vulnerabilities that got released for those types of technologies. And so as a result, if we look at, if I was to try and say to you, what was the single significant thing that happened over COVID, it wouldn't be that our users were being attacked more. It would be that the technologies that we used to enable remote access were being attacked more over that period. But this is a technical thing, and as I said, that dynamic has changed as these vulnerabilities got patched, and our customers slowly but surely started rolling out the patches. And whilst I think the security or insecurity of remote access technologies remains a problem, that extraordinary event has now passed, and we've moved back to a sort of new normal, to abuse a popular phrase. But I do believe that COVID has had some other systemic influences that have changed and will continue to change the threat landscape for several years to come. And so I want to touch on those just briefly on a sort of closing note. The first, as I mentioned, is this adoption of remote work as a standard, and particularly the adoption of VPN technologies. Now, I recognize that this is a noisy slide. Forgive me for that, but basically what it says is that as a result of the lockdown, the use of VPN technologies increased by 41% during March last year globally. And even after the lockdown started easing, it stayed 22% higher globally than in the pre-pandemic levels. Now, that's the global number, but remember that remote work and VPN were already popular in some places. If we look at the places where they were less popular, we see some phenomenal changes in behavior. In Egypt, a 224% increase in VPN, Chile, 150%. In South Africa, where I'm based, which is a developing country, so not as evolved maybe as the West, but certainly not a backwater, VPN adoption increased by 100%, and it stayed like that. So something there has changed fundamentally, and I guess it's obvious, but we are dealing with a remote work world. The other thing that changed phenomenally over that time was the unprecedented adoption of e-commerce as a channel. This data was published by Adobe, and it shows the revenue generated from e-commerce in billions of dollars relative to what they expected. And you can see that in May last year, there was almost $100 billion more spent online than what they had expected to happen. And they argue in their report that that kind of growth is, according to their models, what they would have expected to take 4 to 6 years. So what they expected to happen in 4 to 6 years effectively happened in a month during the lockdown period. Now, we would argue that that kind of rapid digitization, rapid business transformation is extremely impactful from a security point of view, because we don't believe that that sort of rate of change could support the investment in security and testing and resilience and things that we would need. So we believe that there's a significant amount of security debt that would have been accrued during that time. And unless that debt is now paid off in the sort of post-lockdown periods, it's going to come back and bite us. And then the third change that I want to touch on is this idea that we're now suddenly dependent on technologies that we weren't dependent on before. And again, I think it probably stands to reason, but you know, suddenly something like Zoom, which was maybe being experimented with here and there in the companies that you work for, suddenly is now mission critical. We cannot live without it. And if it's not Zoom, then it's Teams or Google Talk or whatever the case may be. But suddenly these cloud-based technologies offered out of the USA, yes, many of them very, very young with very little track record, are suddenly mission critical to our business, and that changes the landscape also. And then finally, I want to draw your attention to a talk that we will be giving in May of this year at the RSA conference. We're very privileged to have been invited to speak there. And what we want to talk about there is the simple reality that as a result of work from home, there is now a key part of our network infrastructure that no longer belongs to us, and that is the end user's local network. The end user is now connecting to a Wi-Fi access point that is given to them by a provider, borrowed from a friend, bought on eBay, who knows where it comes from. And what we do in our RSA talk is to demonstrate a number of significant ways in which this reality changes the security posture of the endpoint. Basically, the endpoint is dependent on the access point for its IP address, its DNS settings, its routes, its proxy configuration, and much more. And because the access point controls all of those things, it has a significant degree of influence over the endpoint from a security point of view. And because we have no control over that home router, we are basically facing a situation where our users are dependent on a piece of technology that is at best untrusted, but at worst compromised and malicious. And we think that's a significant game changer. We haven't seen that exploited to a large degree. There have been some instances, but we think it's a systemic shift that is going to start showing its face over the next few months and years. And so I'm going to end with a quote from a very dear old colleague of mine, Etienne Greef, who's also a South African, actually. And he always used to remind me, he was a very wise man, and he always used to remind me that the impact of some new technology is always overestimated in the short term and underestimated in the long term. And I think that's the way we need to think about the impact of COVID and lockdown. The issue is not so much how the attacker pivoted to exploit COVID as a theme, or how the state-backed actors have pivoted to pursue vaccine information. The issues we need to focus on is how is the landscape underneath us shaped fundamentally, and how is that going to affect us going into the future. And with that, I thank you for your time. Welcome to take questions, and yeah, I wish you a very good day and a very rewarding conference. Thank you.